It's funny how supersessionists will grab on to the blessings. For I know the plans that I have for you. Yeah. But they don't take the judgments. They say that the blessings are for the church, the judgments are for Israel. They were Christ killers. And so because they killed Christ, that was the ultimate rejection. Therefore, we need to reject the people too. Where does the Bible come into all this?
If God is done with Israel, then you have a problem with Revelation. They're getting ready to pour out judgment, and God says, well, hold off until my people are sealed. Who are the people? If God was done with Israel, then why would they still be here?
I'm Chuck Tate, and here at Fellowship of Believers, we encourage families, strengthen marriages, and edify the body of Christ.
I'm Larry Grimm. We also promote biblical doctrine in a fun and engaging way.
And I'm Sarah, and if it's Christian, we're talking about it.
This is the Mike Charleston Show. All right, yes. This is the Mike Charleston Show. Thank you for watching. We are all together. I don't think were we last week? You were gone.
I was gone.
Yeah, you were gone.
Maybe. Was I last week?
No, you were here last week.
You were here.
Okay. Yeah, it was a week before.
Are we here today?
2 weeks ago.
Yeah, next week we're not going to be all together.
Right.
But anyway, if you have not noticed, though, there's been something in the news lately, and I don't really pay attention to the news. We don't get involved in news and politics. That's why we had to change the show opener where we talked about church, family, news. I'm like, we don't do news. Yeah, we don't use it. Israel has been in the news a lot lately. Yeah. And so I thought, man, we've got to talk about this on some level, but what angle how we're going to talk about? So Chuck, what are we talking about today?
Well, the question you got here is God done with Israel?
Is God done with Israel? I wanted to talk about prophecy, like how do you make a show about like that? And so is God done? And so when you talk about this issue in theology, they have come up with words.
Oh, yeah.
And Larry likes to use these big words. So what's the big word?
Suppressionism or supersessionism.
Wow, I gave you
your one. I know, I feel it. I'm thinking of all these other ones. I was going to say replacement theology, and I'm like, that's not the big one.
Supersessionism.
Supersessionism.
You should probably stick with replacement theology.
Yeah, the big word.
You caught me off guard.
Supersessionism is the big word. Known basically as replacement theology. Now, there is a lot of different views within supersessionism and theology and replacement theology. So we're not going to get into all of it, but basically, what is supersessionism?
Basically, the church replaced Israel.
Okay, yeah, I was going to, maybe you're going to read that part right there.
I'm sorry. I guess I could have read it, but
supersessionism.
Or the church superseded Israel and now has become the Israel of God.
Right. That's a very basic understanding. But yeah, it's that the replacement theology or fulfillment theology or even covenant theology or whatever is a Christian theological doctrine which describes the theological conviction, a lot of theological conviction that the Christian church has superseded the nation of Israel, assuming their role as God's covenanted people, thus asserting that the new covenant through Jesus Christ has superseded or replaced the Mosaic covenant exclusive to the Jews. And we'll get into where this came from, but all the promises are now the churches. It's no longer Israel.
Yeah, what's that song? All the promises of Abraham are mine. You don't remember that in Sunday school?
No.
No.
Father Abraham?
No.
No, I remember that one.
I don't. Larry, you know a song we don't know. How about
Apparently.
this? Yeah, this is breaking news.
You'll have to sing it for us later.
Yes, please do. So that is a very broad definition of supersessionism or replacement theology, but that is at the heart of it, that all the promises, all the things that we take from the Old Testament, that the church is replaced Israel.
Replaced Israel.
And that to the point where people like Luther and even like, we'll get into it here, the early church fathers, that not only has God rejected them, he has cursed them, and it is our right to punish Israel for it, which is bizarre as some of the things that were said. Anti-Semitism was alive and well in the first century.
Yeah,
and probably always has been.
Probably so. So where does this idea of replacement theology, where did it originate?
So that's a good question, right? Like, okay, so why does this come about and how? So here's here's the danger of taking the scriptures and what I believe happened. Now, I could be wrong. I'm speculating here, but people saw the news of the day, and they're trying to fit things in with the news of the day. So around the first century, you got to remember when a lot of these people, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Israel is gone at this point. And
as a nation, they're wiped out.
Yeah, at 135 or something like that. By 135, they're gone.
Yeah.
They're
dispersed.
Right, they are dispersed. It's under Roman control, and so Israel is no longer a nation. So if you're reading the Bible, if you're a Christian, you're wondering like, well, maybe God is done with Israel. They're no longer a country, and so we are becoming more and more. The church is becoming more and more Gentile. So maybe it's for us. So one of the first people to talk about this, and we don't have some of the quotes from their writings and things like that, but you can look it up. It's just trust us on this. But Justin Martyr, he was around, and that's an interesting last name. I don't know.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, Justin Martyr.
Oh, that too.
So good old Justin, he was around from 100 to 165 AD. He claimed Christians are the true Israelic race. The seed of Jacob refers to Christians, not the Jews. So the problem with replacement theology is it really challenges your hermeneutics. Larry, here's another big word: hermeneutics,
or dispensationalism.
Okay, but that's another term. But that's a part of hermeneutics,
right?
But so hermeneutics is what
the method of studying the Bible.
How you study the Bible, right?
Yeah.
So you can spiritualize things, you can allegorize things, or you can kind of take things literally. And when we talk about literal, it's not just you take it like Jesus is the door. You understand within the context of language that there are similes, there are metaphors, and so on and so forth.
You realize that Jesus spoke in parables.
Yes, right. But we don't go back and spiritualize some of the prophecies. We don't have to say that Jacob and Esau, that when it says the older will serve the younger, that you turn and say, well, Israel is Jacob, not Jacob, Esau, and now the church is Jacob, which Jacob has never, ever been associated anything but with Israel. Right. His name became Israel.
His name became Israel, that's right.
So then we move on to Tertullian, and Tertullian was around 145 to 220. He's the one that came up with the Jacob-Esau concept, the older and will serve the younger, which is I'm like, come on, man. That's not a very good argument.
That's a stretch.
It's just symbolic.
It is. Yeah, it's an allegory, and we're going to run with it. And
Which, by the way, who changed Jacob's name?
God did.
Yeah, it wasn't Jacob. He didn't pick that. God did.
No. Yeah, so God changed it to Israel.
Yeah.
And Tertullian also, since the Jews were originally the people of God, they are the older ones. We just kind of talked about this, and the Gentiles are Jacob and so on and so forth. Then we go into Origen, and Origen has a shady past here, and
he was a Gnostic, if I remember correctly.
Okay, yeah, well,
I don't know.
And he's from 185 to 253 AD. So this is building, and this is still the church that is persecuted, and they're not officially, the Constantine has not come in and stepped foot on he hasn't become the empire is not the empire yet.
But I would say these teachings actually gave some credence to what he did and how he established the state church blending.
So then Origen, he was president of School of Theology in Alexandria, Egypt. There's two schools of thoughts, and one was more Alexandrian, one was Antiochian. Yep. We're not going to get into that right now, but he developed the allegorical method of interpreting the Bible. So his hermeneutics, he was open about it. He was like, we have to take it allegorically, which the Catholic Church would then run with.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they ran with this. They loved Origen and all them. Israel didn't mean Israel. It was just spiritual Israel / the church. Then Augustine comes on the scene, and Augustine is the big one. You know?
Yeah.
The 354 to 430, he concluded that there will not be a literal 1,000-year reign. So he came up with the amillennial, another theological term, which meaning no or not, and millennial. So no millennial. It's not literal. It's figurative. Yeah, it's allegorical once again, and this became very prevalent in the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
is something the Catholic Church
we are in the
believes.
millennial now.
Yeah,
But
this
since that
is
time,
very common with Catholic Church and even the most Calvinists. Not all Calvinists, but most Calvinists would believe these things. He applied allegory method to all future events, amillennialism. He taught the church is the kingdom of God in Daniel 2 and 7 and Revelation 20. The Roman Church adopted this view. And anyway, so that's kind of the history of it, Chuck, since you asked the question. That's kind of where it came from. And actually, we were reading about something else, and I didn't think about this, but it is interesting that how you were describing it. You read the article, not me. I didn't read it, but you were telling me about it, and it kind of made sense that the early church was very family oriented. Like the method of meeting, they didn't build buildings.
Yeah.
They didn't have a priesthood. They didn't have any of these things that the church is associated with now.
Yeah.
And but because all these teachings, it pointed that, hey, we've replaced Israel. Guess what? We need a priesthood now. We need to do the sacrifices where the Catholic Church now does the Mass.
Yeah.
Because they have to do the sacrifices as the Jewish people did. And so all these things, because we took over, now we had to spiritualize those things and took over. And I was like, you know what? I never even thought about it, but it does make sense. So just think about that.
Right. Well, you think about it in the Old Testament, they had a temple.
Yep.
With the altar, do the sacrifice.
They had a special priest class.
And that's when Constantine legalized Christianity, gave them what used to be pagan temples, and they now became churches, Christian churches. But also, he gave them tax breaks, and if you were a pastor, you didn't have to pay taxes.
Sure.
So the church blended with the state, just like in Israel. It was a theocracy in the beginning, and then it became a monarchy. But still, the theology of Israel, it was part ruling. The priests were part rulers of the nation,
Right.
and in combination with the king. But then, as Christianity in the 300s, that's when they kind of took these ideas from the earlier church fathers, blended them together, and say, "Hey, yeah, we're now the Israel of God, the churches."
Right. So this has been back from the very beginning. I mean, we're not removed too much from the scriptures even being written in 90 AD, when John writes Revelation, and maybe even the book of John. But those are like the last books that we believe were written, and just one generation, we're already forgetting that Jesus was Jewish, that the disciples were all Jewish, that the first Christians, all 3,000 of them were Jewish. The majority of the Christian church was Jewish, and at some point they separated it. It got so anti-Semitic that, in fact, we've covered this before on the Easter show, the pagan holiday Easter, that when they redid the calendar, the Catholic Church made it so that we will never celebrate the resurrection of Christ on the actual day that he raised. If you want to know when Jesus raised from the dead, it's not that hard. It's in the Bible.
He's just
Right, it's in the Bible. When the big Passover was, it was right then and there. You don't have to figure out, go look at the Jewish calendar. But we don't want to do that because we don't want anything to do with Jews. And so let me just say this, we're not like super lovers of Jews, like we need to go back and be Jewish and keep the law. And if you've watched the show, you should know that by now.
You're not going to put on your yarmulke?
No, not going to do all that. But there is the argument that we're portraying here is God done with Israel?
Right.
That's the question. And obviously we're in the church age, and we are grafted into these things. And I know people that believe in supersessionism, they're going to say that Israel can be saved, they can become believers.
Right.
But that's about all the future plans that God has for them is done away with. He is not going to have anything to do with them anymore. So anyway.
So it's interesting to me. I've never really studied replacement theology or supersessionism, which I've never heard of before today. But it's interesting that you mentioned that, given the time frame when this came about, there was no nation of Israel. You had the Jewish people; they were scattered, and so it's interesting to think that maybe these folks were trying to fit it into their current position. And I think that's a caution for us, to actually make sure we're not approaching God's word and trying to make it fit into what we experience.
Right. No, and I think that's very natural. That they would probably look around like, well, my goodness, God abandoned them. I mean, but some of the things they said are very brutal. I mean, Luther was such an anti-Semite, and to read some of the things that he said, he believed that the Jews should be exterminated. Yeah. And it's no wonder that just a few generations later, they did exactly what Luther was saying, that they should be put in their own little towns and things called ghettos, and put in their little neighborhoods, and they should be exterminated and all these things and punished. And he didn't say it like I just said it, but
well, he did say to burn synagogues and like their places of worship and whatever. So I mean, and I don't know. Hitler calls him our great national hero. Luther.
Yeah. So let's get into it a little bit more. The question here is, what's wrong? What's wrong with believing replacement theology like Luther did?
Yeah, well, and before we tackle that question, we have to mention that we said the Catholics are very much into this, the amillennialism, and they are replacement theology, they're supersessionism, and same thing with Calvinists. A lot of Calvinists are. But to be fair, there's the new churches that are springing up, the big churches that are out there, the non-denominational churches, the what we would call part of the NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation. A lot of charismatic churches. I shouldn't say a lot of them, because the church I grew up in was a charismatic church, and they definitely did not believe this. But a lot of the newer churches fall into this. We'll talk about that later here. But what's wrong with believing in replacement theology? And to be fair, there can be genuine believers that believe this. We're not trying to say that they're not saved if you believe this. Smart people have been studying these things for centuries. But what is wrong with believing in replacement theology? Well, what about the blessings for the church, but not the judgments? Now, this is a very oversimplistic argument.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying by that is you have prophecies, you have promises in the Old Testament. It's funny how the supersessionists will grab on to the blessings.
Yeah,
For I know the plans that I have for you, and Jeremiah 29:11. But they don't take the judgments. They say that the blessings are for the church, the judgments are for Israel.
Yeah,
but that's convenient.
You can't separate them. They both came together.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, Well, the other thing, like you mentioned prophecy, when the angel came to Daniel and he said, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people. Well, who was Daniel's people?
That's the next point.
So
it major changes in eschatology. So you have to change your belief about end time stuff, and you might say, okay, well, I don't know what I believe about end times. Does it really matter? Well, it does.
Yeah, it does.
It really does in some ways. Now, at the end of the day, like if you were a post-trib or mid-trib or pre-trib, it doesn't matter when he comes back. But if you're an amillennialist, it sure does.
Yeah, or preterist.
Or preterist even, that just sounds bad. Yeah. But, your major changes in eschatology. So the old Israel had a priesthood, so God wants us to be the new church to have a priesthood. Well, you're going to have... Wait, no, that's ecclesiology.
Yeah, and we already talked about that.
Well, God made a covenant with Abraham that he would have descendants, like the sand of the sea, stars of the heavens.
Right.
But then he also reiterated in a way that covenant with David, saying that you will always have a descendant on the throne. That's not a throne in heaven. That was actually the throne in Israel, in Jerusalem.
Right.
That's what he's talking about.
Yeah. A lot of these promises are going to have to be spiritualized.
Right.
Somehow,
and that's where you go back to Origin and the allegorizing everything.
Right.
But he would also say that the Mosaic covenant that God made with Abraham was replaced by the new covenant in Jesus Christ.
Right.
That's a good point. But then you have some issues with
like we talked about in the Sabbath, like the on the Sabbath episode that we did here recently, that the Mosaic covenant was for a certain time.
Right.
Abrahamic covenant was everlasting. Davidic covenant was everlasting. So we have to understand these things. And this is where hermeneutics come in. So ecclesiology, which I meant to say not eschatology, but even though it does change your eschatology too.
Yeah.
And if you're an amillennialist or a preterist or something, it does change how you study the Bible. I can tell how you study the Bible, how you take the Bible based on your eschatology.
Oh yeah.
If you don't if you're a millennialist, I know that you pretty much allegorize a lot of the scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's an allegory. If you take things pretty literally, you're going to be some kind of pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib type of person. The closer you get to post-trib, a little bit more spiritual in that. But the effects on replacement theology on the Jews. So the persecution of Jewish people by the Roman Church started early and often. I mean, they crushed them.
Yeah.
But even people like Martin Luther, and we got into this a little bit, but the specific things, he told people to burn down synagogues, helped lay the foundation of the Holocaust. Hitler called Luther our great national hero. And that's Hitler, just pointing out some of the things that Luther had taught. Some of these people, we didn't go into some of the quotes that the early church fathers had, or even Hitler, but some of them, I'm not going to quote them exactly, so I guess it won't be a quote. I'll just paraphrase.
Yeah.
But they were saying things like they were Christ killers. And so because they killed Christ, that was the ultimate rejection. Therefore, we need to reject the people too. Well, where does the Bible come into all this? This is the problem I have, is that part of the Bible is love one another. Love your enemies. So even if we were to say the Israelites were enemies, we're still to love them.
Right.
We're not supposed to burn down their synagogues.
Well, technically speaking, the Jews did not kill Jesus.
No, the Romans did.
The Romans did.
Right.
I mean, they persuaded them, but the Romans still had... So
we're all guilty.
The Romans were Gentiles.
Yes, right.
So are we to hate Gentiles because they killed Christ? I mean, and then Jesus also said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Yeah.
So...
And the church doesn't have the chance to crucify Jesus because, well, he's already been crucified and risen. Right. So I bet you we would have at some point. But
for sure.
Some of those reasonings are bizarre.
Yeah.
They just want to find a reason to blame. If it had not been for the Jews rejecting Messiah, we wouldn't be in, as we're going to read here pretty shortly.
Right.
So we should be grateful, honestly. But to go around persecuting them is a shame.
What is it Paul said? Blindness in part has happened to Israel.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what Romans, is that chapter 4, I think, or 5?
4 or 5.
Somewhere around there, I think, yeah. But like you said, if we were there, if the church existed at that time, the church probably would have been part of the party to crucify Christ.
Yeah, because we're all a part of this.
Yeah.
We're all guilty. My sin put him there.
Right.
So it's just because the Jews persuaded him to be crucified, the Romans actually put the nails in him.
Yeah.
So who actually? It doesn't matter. We're all complicit in this.
So going back to our topic question, is God done with Israel? What's the Bible? Let's look at the scripture. What's the Bible got to say about it?
Yes. So the verse that automatically comes to mind, and actually it's a portion of scripture, Romans 9 through 11. You can actually go.
Okay, yeah. I thought you were saying this verse, but you were talking about all chapters.
Right. You could go Romans 9 through 14 almost, but it deals with a lot of these. But specifically Romans 11, 19 through 25. We didn't know which portions to pull out of Romans 11. It's so clear in Romans 11. But maybe you haven't been talking. Why don't you go ahead and read?
Okay. Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God. On them which fell, severity, but toward thee goodness. If thou continue in his goodness, otherwise thou also shalt be cut off.
Okay, let me stop you right there. So there's a lot of going on here. So because of their unbelief, they were broken off. So he's talking about a tree here, and he's talking about how Israel had been broken off. So they're like, see, they're gone.
Yeah, right.
They were broken off, but and we were grafted in. So we were wild by nature. We were contrary to the things of God, and we weren't His people. But just like Jeremiah was saying that, prophesied that in Jeremiah 31, that there was going to be a time where there was a how does it say it? Where help me out here. There's going to be a people who were not a people that were going to be a people, and they would be His God, or that God would be their God. And but because of this, they were the Gentiles were becoming high-minded, like we replaced Israel. This is kind of the background of this, that we get the blessings of all these things, and he's saying not so much here, that they were broken off, that you might be grafted in. So go ahead and continue.
And they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, shall be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again.
So He can graft them in again, which I think He will.
Yeah.
For if thou wert cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and wert grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these, which shall be the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? For I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, lest ye should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in.
There's that verse.
Yeah, there you go. Read on, right?
Yeah.
The fullness of the Gentiles must happen. This must come apart. There's other prophecies in the Old Testament that needed to be fulfilled. And Ezekiel 34, I believe, or the one in Jeremiah, that's the one. There it is, 31. I guess we can go right there. Jeremiah 31, 35 through 36.
It says, Thus saith the Lord, which giveth the sun for a light by day, and the ordinances of the moon and of the stars for a light by night, which divideth the sea when the waves thereof roar. The Lord of hosts is His name. If those ordinances depart from before me, saith the Lord, then the seed of Israel also shall cease from being a nation before me forever.
Right. So basically saying that the sun rises, the stars are out, the moon and all that, and when they go away, then Israel will go away.
So it's God's mind. Israel never stopped being a nation.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And in fact, do you have the Acts 1? Yeah, Acts 1, 6 through 7.
When they therefore were come together, they asked of him, saying, Lord, wilt thou at this time restore again the kingdom to Israel? And he said unto them, It is not for you to know the times or the seasons which the Father hath put in His own power.
So this is after He's risen. Mm-hmm. So they've been expecting Jesus to come to power and to crush the Romans, and it didn't work out the way they thought. In fact, it worked out better. Wow, He's conquered death and sin, and like, wow, we're now free, and so. But they still believing in the promises.
They were looking for that kingdom still.
Right, and rightly so. And because of all the promises. And so they're like, Jesus never corrected them and said, no, you guys still don't get it. Right? It's not about this. The kingdom is already here. It's a spiritual kingdom, and you'll find out when the Comforter comes and all that. And in fact, he doesn't correct them at all. He says it's just not time. Yeah. It's not time. And
a good point is, I mentioned at the beginning the word dispensationalism. If you don't have a correct dispensation view of the Bible, you're going to be off on your theology. At the end of Romans 11, you mentioned, it says the fullness, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. That means there's a time period for the Gentiles.
Sure.
Right.
So there's a time period for these things that God hasn't. Sometimes those time periods are long, sometimes they're short, but we have to understand those dispensations.
There can be problems with dispensationalism.
Right.
You may not like everything that goes along with it, but to go the other way with covenant theology, there's huge problems over there. But there has to be some kind of dispensation where God deals with people differently.
Yeah, we have the Old and New Testament.
There's different covenants. Before I'm going to go to Genesis 17:7 up here, and why don't you go ahead and read that?
And I will establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee in their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee and to thy seed after thee.
He's talking to Abraham there, right. And these are everlasting covenants. Psalm 105, 8 through 11.
He hath remembered his covenant forever, the word which he commanded to 1,000 generations, which covenant he made with Abraham, and his oath unto Isaac, and confirmed the same unto Jacob for a law, and to Israel for an everlasting covenant, saying, Unto thee will I give the land of Canaan, the lot of your inheritance.
So that is an inheritance. That is not a promise for us,
right?
The church. No. We don't inherit Israel, the land of Canaan. That is not for us. And the problem is when we go to the scriptures and we read the Bible like a devotional, and we open it up and we're like, speak to me. How does this affect my life today? And like, what can I get out of this? It's very dangerous.
Yes.
And we go to Jeremiah 29:11 and say, for I know the plans you have for me, and it has nothing to do with you.
Right.
It's talking about Israel being restored. If you go back and look at the context, there's a lot of judgment there.
Yeah, right.
And then he says, but it's only for a short time,
right.
and I'm going to restore you back into your land, and so on and so forth. It has nothing to do with us, even though it's true.
Right.
Right. God does have plans for us, and sure, that's fine. But we just throw these verses out, sprinkle them out there as if they belong to us, and they don't. We have to read the Bible the way it was intended, and then we can understand things a little bit better.
Yeah, it was written for us, but not to us.
Yes, exactly. It's designed for us to understand.
Just give a cliche.
There you go. Where are we at? Hosea 3:5.
Afterward shall the children of Israel return and seek the Lord their God and David their king, and shall fear the Lord and his goodness in the latter days.
In the latter days, they shall return.
Oh, Joel's army.
Well, which I don't understand how. I can understand how, like Chuck, you were saying earlier about how because of what was happening.
Yeah.
But when 1948 happened,
That's exactly what I was thinking. It's like, now what am I doing?
maybe we should rethink our theology.
Yeah, exactly.
Nope, we're sticking with it. And
well, you think about it. How many? So the Jews were dispersed, and I think it's like 586 BC, something like that, by the Babylonians. Maybe the dates are wrong.
But I thought it was much earlier than that.
That was for.
Are you talking about BC?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
That was for for 70 years.
Yep.
Right,
Then. The Medo-Persian Empire came. Cyrus became king.
Yep.
He gave the commission for them to go back to their land.
Absolutely.
Right. And then the Romans, years later, the Romans took over. The Romans actually called the land Palestine. That's where we get the word Palestine from.
Right.
To take away their national identity, they changed the name of their land. But in 70 AD, Titus, the Roman general, came in. There was a siege. They destroyed Jerusalem, dispersed the Jews again.
Yeah.
And they remained dispersed until 1948.
1948 it became a country again.
So it's the only people group in history to maintain their national identity throughout their history like that, even though they were dispersed several times.
Yeah. Think about that.
Yeah, it's
this nothing country, small country. We're talking about the size of New Jersey.
Yeah,
it is such a issue in world politics. If you don't believe the scriptures, I'm like, come on, man. This is All right, Zechariah 13:8-9.
And it shall come to pass that in all the land, saith the Lord, 2 parts therein shall be cut off and die, but the third shall be left therein. And I will bring the third part through the fire, and will refine them as silver is refined, and will try them as gold is tried. They shall call on my name, and I will hear them. I will say, it is my people, and they shall say, the Lord is my God.
Yeah. Yeah, we have some here that some teachers, and I don't necessarily want to go through some of the teachers.
A thing with, if God is done with Israel, then you have a problem with Revelation. Was it chapter 7? I think it is 6, where the angel, they're getting ready to pour out judgment, and God says, well, hold off until my people are sealed. And who are the people?
The church?
It's 12. Yeah, it's not the church. It's 12,000 people from each of the 12 tribes of Israel.
Very specific.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's not
How do you
the
spiritualize
church.
that?
And if Israel is not here and God's done with them, then why have that in the Bible?
Right.
It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I believe
Plus
he's
you're Jehovah's Witness.
Well, there you go.
That's right.
Well, you have you talking about going back to Romans 11. You're going to have the cutoff that Israel's been cut off, and yes, are they like active in God's plan right now? Probably not. Like with salvation,
right?
The salvation that comes through grace through faith. faith, by faith, is out there available for all, and it's not coming through the Jewish people anymore. They're not the ones propagating, the message, and so they're in a state of rebellion. They are rejecting God, but God has plans for his people, because he's going to keep his promises to Jacob, Isaac, Abraham. He's going to keep his promises to them. And in fact, we're going to be cut off. I believe that's what the rapture is, personally. That it's a cutting off, and he's going to engraft them back in. Yeah. It's Jacob's trouble. That's what the tribulation is, and he's purifying Israel at that point, and all of Israel will be saved. That's what in Romans 11 it goes on to say, that all of Israel will be saved at that point, and they will look on him who they have pierced, and what does it say in Zechariah 10? They'll look on him who pierced and believe, or something like that. But
I have to look it up.
We don't have that reference handy.
To your point, this is something that I think people need to understand. The nation of Israel is different than the church, but the people of Israel, they need to be saved the same way as a Gentile. Your salvation is only through Christ, even though you may be a Jew and you may be a practicing Jew, but if you want to be saved, you have to come through Christ.
Right.
Just as any other Gentile or Jew, it's for everybody. It's the same. So, but we're talking about just specifically the nation as a whole, and the nation of Israel as a whole.
Absolutely. Like as a nation, God's still not done with them. No. So the things in the news that we see are quite interesting. Is this where some of the prophecies are talking about, where people are going to attack and God miraculously saves Israel? Is the rapture soon? I always keep my eyes on the Middle East. Yeah. To me, those are important issues to pay attention to. And you found it?
I did.
In Zechariah 12:10. Mm-hmm. Right. And I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, and they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one that is in bitterness of this firstborn. I don't think that has happened.
No.
When has that happened?
Not yet. Right. It's coming.
They have rejected Messiah.
Well, if God was done with Israel, then why would they still be here?
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, that's a question they're not answering.
Back to why are they back?
Does that mean God's not capable? God's not capable.
When you think about it, how small of a country they are, with all those people who hate them. Yeah. Well, my question to you, without God, why would they exist?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They should have been wiped off a long time ago. Yeah. But God still has a plan for them, and I think that's
obvious. And the Jewish people are still believing the promises of God that they've had from their heritage.
Some of them,
Some of them, but they're still looking forward to those promises, and someday they're going to see it and realize that it wasn't what they thought it was.
Right, and God will get them to that point.
That will get them there.
And it's a purifying that some may say is cruel, but it's a way to get them to turn to Him.
If you read the book of Judges, that's a series of, they would follow God, then they would not. They'd go after idols. God would bring judgment.
That was
cry out to God.
Yes.
And then God would send a deliverer. They would turn back to God for a time. So there will come a time where the nation of Israel will turn its eyes towards God. Mm-hmm. I think it's coming. Soon. But I don't know
before we get off here real quick, we want to some of these terms. So replacement theology, supersessionism, is taught in Kingdom Now theology. You might hear that too. Yeah. Kingdom Now theology or dominionism. You might hear some of that term, or the latter rain, or the New Apostolic Reformation. I know we just threw out a bunch of terms, but if you ever hear those things, be assured that they believe in supersessionism, or that Israel has been replaced by the church. And it is a dangerous teaching. Now, most people that are involved in this aren't anti-Semites, to be fair. Yeah. They were not wanting the destruction of the Jews. They're just misinformed, and they don't know their Bible very well. But it can be, as we know, that some of these, if you just look up some of the early church fathers and what they said about the Jews, it's like, good night.
Right?
They are.
Where's the Christian love?
It is brutal. I'm like, good night.
I think that when we see these people who have this theology and have this idea, it goes back to what Paul was writing in a warning, that they're thinking too high-mindedly of themselves.
Exactly.
They're thinking about me and not necessarily that the Jews have been put away, but that I'm better.
Yeah.
Same kind of idea the Jews had against all the Gentiles. I'm better.
Yeah,
exactly.
We're all these people.
Yeah, be careful that you say that, because God's still got something for them.
Yeah.
And in fact, if it wasn't for their failure, you wouldn't be drafted in. And so I'm thankful personally that they did reject Messiah.
Yeah.
And now it's open for all of us.
Yep.
Because let's be fair, the Jews were originally supposed to be the ones to bring the message of God to the world, and they didn't do it.
Well, that's the whole point when Jesus said, "You are the light of the world." He's talking to the nation of Israel.
Right.
They were that light. They were supposed to be the light of the world. They failed.
Right.
And
Yep.
So
and so do we.
exactly.
We fail at it too. But anyway, we're trying to take a huge topic and put it in a half-hour window. So I know we skipped over some important details and we didn't get into all the specifics and all the verses, but that's just a thing to get you a taste for it.
Yeah.
And go search for it yourself. Go look up supersessionism and go look at where it started. That's interesting, because all those early church fathers and all the people of the faith that you think is so wonderful, Calvin and Luther and Huss and all them, they had some pretty harsh things to say, not very loving things. But anyway, go check it out yourself.
The Mike Charleston Show.
History with Larry.
All right, Larry.
All right.
Telling the joke right before we go on. Huh?
That's good timing.
That was good.
Comedy, it's all about timing.
What are you doing?
It's all about timing. Okay, so this week's history time with Larry.
It's a good one.
Oh, it's a good one.
And it's kind of because, Israel's in the news.
Oh, is it?
And I thought I'd do something on Israel. So
Sure.
For those who haven't paid attention to the news, yes, Israel is in the news.
Well, they're always, but why are they in the news?
Well, because of the...
They got attacked by... Yeah, they got attacked by Hamas.
That's right.
I think all these British people like Hamas. I'm like, it's Hamas people.
I know.
Hamas.
All right.
Tonight on our news, Israel has been
Hamas.
attacked by Hamas. And I'm like, no, it's Hamas. Anyway,
You're going to like the opening because I know you like musicals.
Oh,
right?
Do I?
Yeah.
Okay.
And all the opera, we can't forget about the opera. Who doesn't like, you got the live music. It has a rich history. You got the costumes, the song, the singers, the
We
stage.
are talking about opera?
Well, like I said, who doesn't enjoy a good opera?
Do you?
No,
Okay.
I don't. And that's why this story has none of that.
Oh, okay.
But
No opera.
we're going to come back to that. You'll see why we started with that in a minute. But, so this is a true story.
Okay.
There's a lot more behind the scenes, but we're going to focus on the end of the story. But it culminated on June 7th, 1981.
Oh, so recent history.
Yeah, you were just a wee little lad.
I was 5 years old, I think.
No, 1981. You were
5 years old.
Yeah, you would have been 5.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, way little lad.
Yes.
I was 11.
Wow.
Baby
Whoa.
steps.
Yeah.
Baby steps.
Baby
Yes,
steps.
Absolutely.
This story is full of espionage and intrigue and mystery.
Intriguing, Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, is this James Bond?
Kind of. Some of the stuff behind the scenes, it has some of those elements to it. So in the 70s,
Okay.
the leader of Iraq, his name's going to sound familiar, Saddam Hussein.
No kidding.
Yeah,
I remember that name.
Yeah, he was popular
Yeah.
for a time.
He's the guy in the...
He's the guy in that thing. Yeah, that's right. Well, he made a deal with France to build a nuclear facility. But maybe they're calling.
I don't know.
Mossad
Was
is
that
calling.
you?
No.
Okay. That was at that computer, Joshua? Okay.
The Mossad is calling.
Yes.
Anyway, they made a deal with France to build a nuclear reactor. Funny, they named it Tammuz 1, and they're going to build 2 of them. Tammuz 1 and
Tammuz or Tumaz?
Tammuz.
Tammuz. Okay.
Do you know who that is?
Yes, I know who that is.
The son of Nimrod.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's like the something with Christmas.
Yeah, well, sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, Nimrod had, anyway,
That's kind of interesting why they picked that name. Yeah. But anyway.
Truly, you have a dizzying intellect.
Now, Iraq said that these facilities were only going to be for supplying electricity and for research.
Oh, of course.
Of course, but who need, they need a nuclear reactor for power and all that, and for maybe a few bombs. But, that's down the road a bit. Israel thought that's a bad idea.
You don't think?
Yeah.
Okay.
And they tried to persuade France to not be a part of this.
How did they try? Did they?
Yeah, that's right. Well, they tried some diplomatic approaches. Those didn't work. And then they resorted to some nefarious methods.
Sabotage.
More like...
opera.
There were poisons involved.
Oh, wow.
With top scientists.
Good night.
If I guess they figured if they don't have scientists, they won't...
assassination.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's how serious they took it. But that didn't work. They went ahead with the program, and they were building these reactors. And on June 7th, 1981, Israel decided, we got to do something. These reactors, they're almost finished, and if they get operational, we can't destroy them then because the fallout, the radiation would be too great.
That's a good point.
We got to do something.
Smart people.
Yeah. Well, they decided we're going to go for it, and they came up with a plan.
This is the way.
Yes, this is the way. They had to get... This is a really cool thing because they had to get some intelligence on where it was and how to attack it.
Inconceivable.
Right before this time, Iraq and Iran actually went to war with each other.
Yeah, they did.
And Iran actually tried to blow up this facility. They were unsuccessful. But in the process, they were able to destroy some of the planes of the Iraqis.
Okay.
Israel, their planes weren't quite capable of making the flight all the way there and back.
What are you talking about? Their planes weren't able to make the flight.
Well, because of
Was this
fuel.
World War II?
Well, they could have made the flight, but the return, they wouldn't have had enough fuel to make the...
I mean, they are neighbors, right?
Well, yeah, but it was like 1,100, almost 1,100 miles, something like that. It was quite a ways. So right before then, they already had a deal with the United States, Lockheed Martin, to buy some F-16s.
Oh, yeah.
And they actually got possession of them early, which... Those planes had the capacity, plus they added extra fuel tanks to them. So they took off on June 7th, 1981. They flew from the southern part of Israel. They had to cross the Gulf of Aqaba.
Okay.
And then they had to fly into Saudi Arabia and Jordan.
That was a hard one to say.
Get to, the Jordanian. Funny thing, they're flying over the Gulf. The king of Jordan happened to be on vacation at the time on his yacht, and he sees these planes fly over.
Wow.
They're flying low, and he could see the Israeli markings. Let me back up.
Back up.
There were 6 F-16s. They had 3 extra fuel tanks. 2 of them were 370 gallons, and then they had a 300-gallon tank on the belly. The other 2 were on the wings.
Sure.
And then they were loaded with each of the 6 F-16s were loaded with 2 2,000-pound bombs, and then some other armaments. They weren't messing around.
No, I guess not.
And they were shadowed by 8 F-15 fighter jets.
Okay.
In case they ran into any problems,
sure. You want to be prepared.
Anyway, so the king of Jordan, King Hussein, saw these planes, and he figured, I know where they're going. Even though they kind of went out of their way, but he's like, where else would they be going? He tried to reach Saddam Hussein, couldn't get through. The phone call never made it.
Text him. Should have just texted him.
1981.
Yeah.
It's technology.
Yeah.
They had to fly at low altitudes, but when they got over Saudi Arabia, they spoke in a sort of a
spoken tongues?
No, Arabic accent.
Okay.
And then when they were flying over Saudi Arabia, they used their Jordanian radio signals and flight pattern. And then when they were flying over Jordan, they used a Saudi Arabian Arabic accent.
Okay.
Just to make it sound like they were not Israeli.
Okay.
And caused attention. The other thing they learned through intel was that the border of Iraq and Saudi Arabia, they had 2 towers for air traffic. There was a gap in between them.
And they buzzed the tower. They went right through it.
They went right through that gap.
Right through it.
Iraq knew the gap was there, but they figured it's the border with Saudi Arabia. Why fix it? There's no need to. So they didn't. And Israel knew about it, so they flew right through that gap. When they got into Iraq airspace, they lowered their altitude to about 100 to 300 feet off the ground.
That's kind of dangerous.
Yeah. Well, they didn't want to be detected by radar.
Yeah.
The only downside is they had to be aware of any ground fire because they were so low that they were. But when they got to within about 12 miles of their target, they flew up to about 8,000 feet and then took a dive down over the
construction.
target.
Yeah.
And just dropped their bombs. And they pretty much all of them hit their target.
Yeah.
And they flew up to 40,000 feet and booked it home. And before the Iraqis knew what happened, it was too late.
Too late.
They were already back home, and without a scratch. They all made it back home without a scratch.
What does that have to do with opera?
Yeah.
Good question.
Let's say,
So you may not have heard of this.
The Phantom of the Opera?
No, this event, but it was called Operation Opera.
Oh, Operation Opera.
Okay.
Okay.
That's what they called
Did
it.
they sing their way there?
I don't know, but they were. But it was a little. I mean, it was an event. Israel. Yeah, that's right. Israel was condemned by the rest of the world for doing this.
Right? I'm sure they were.
Until 10 years later. And I don't know if you remember what happened 10 years later.
We invaded Iraq.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we realized how important it was that Iraq didn't have nuclear capabilities.
Yeah.
Wow.
So because Israel took a risk, and it was a dangerous mission.
I mean, that's an act of war. Honestly.
Yeah, it sure was.
I'm surprised they didn't declare war.
I think the problem was because of the war between Iran and Iraq. Iraq
They
just
didn't want a
have
two-front war.
Yeah, and so
Wow.
yeah, they didn't, and they at the time they didn't try to reconstruct the
Operation Opera.
Operation Opera.
Sweet.
Yeah, in 1981.
So that was an opera that you were probably maybe they should make a musical about it.
That's right. That's an opera I enjoyed reading about.
The Mike Charleston Show. Music with Sarah.
What song do you like?
All right, babe. This week, your song of the week is kind of a mix. We got a little mix of the new and the old. It's an old hymn that's kind of been redone a little bit, right?
It is. It's this one's called One Day.
One Day.
In parentheses, when we all get to heaven.
So when we all get to heaven, that's the old traditional hymn.
Right.
And they add some verses, they One Day.
Right.
And,
this is by Matt Redman on his album called Glory Song.
Glory Song.
Which actually the whole album's really good. But anyway, this song, the verses are very different than the hymn.
Sure.
So if you're one of those people that's a purist and a hymn has to stay a hymn, then maybe this one's not for you. But you should listen to it and give it a try.
Well, he just wrote a whole nother song, but threw the hymn chorus in.
Right.
So
Yeah.
he's not like trying to remake the hymn.
No, not at all. But I mean, I love the hymn. The hymn's very happy and upbeat. This song is also happy. I mean, it's talking about when we get to heaven.
Sure.
So it's happy, but
Which is getting closer every day.
It is getting closer.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, this one's not so upbeat, but I think it's really beautiful. And he says, one day you'll make everything new, Jesus. One day you will bind every wound. The former things shall all pass away. No more tears. One day you'll make sense of it all, Jesus. One day every question resolved, every anxious thought left behind. No more fear. And then he goes into the chorus. And anyways, interesting because the other day I was listening to it on repeat for a while. And Elizabeth and Lydia were working on schoolwork or whatever. They had headphones on. So we each were listening to our own things, and they looked up and I was just crying, and they were like, why are you crying? They said, what are you listening to? And I said, this song. And they're like, it's supposed to be a happy song, which it is happy. It's wonderful.
But there's tears of joy.
But there are tears of joy. And
At least you weren't talking to me. And then, yeah, that got me off the hook there.
okay. But the second verse says, one day we will see face to face
That's the third
Jesus.
verse.
Yeah, okay. Is there a greater vision of grace than in a moment we shall be changed on that day? One day we'll be free, all the struggles will cease, and we'll see his glory revealed. And just, I don't know, in this life we can get caught up with the struggles and just the things that weigh us down. And it's like, you know what? none of that's going to matter. All these things that we worry about and we care about and we get caught up on, none of it's going to matter. And in a moment, we'll be changed. Everything will change, and we'll see him as he is, and we'll know him, and we'll be with him for all eternity. And it's
absolutely.
I don't know. So it can be a little.
You like
overwhelming.
heaven songs, so if you know my wife, if it's a heaven song, she likes heaven.
I love to sing about heaven.
Absolutely. Well, why not? That is our destination. We're just camping here. We're just passing through. And we need to be reminded of that. I don't think enough people write heaven songs anymore.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, and it just is a great perspective to have, thinking about heaven. And it does help you realize just the temporalness, if that's a word.
Temporal.
How temporal this life is, you know. And we read, oh, yeah, this life is but a vapor. But in our reality, in our day-to-day, we feel like this is just, life keeps us going and keeps us busy, and we're just here.
Kind of like today.
Pretty much. You just go. But it's like, you know what? This is just a fleeting moment in the span of all of eternity. And so when we all get to heaven, that's where life really begins, and it will be a day of rejoicing, so I can't wait.
Absolutely. So this is Matt Redman, and then the album is Glory Song. This song is called One Day. So go check it out, and see if Sarah has good taste.
The Mike Charleston Show. Marriage.
All right, babe. We are finished with your book, but we're not finished with the Marriage Minute here. I don't even know why we call it. Is it Marriage Minute, or it's the moment of... We're talking about marriage here. And we will just preface this a little bit, that this might be a little bit longer than just like our 5-minute little segment here. But we're going to talk about a situation that kind of came up. And what would we do? And so the situation was, and I don't really know these people, so I don't have to worry about saying their names because I don't know their names, but it was a friend of mine that was relaying this story to me, and like, what would you do, or what, and then so this lady is afraid that her husband is joining a cult, or is part of a cult, and specifically the Hebrew Roots movement, and I would kind of share those concerns, but she's trying to get him to watch these videos, or trying to get someone to talk to her husband. She does not want to go to the meetings. So what does she do? And I was like, that's actually a pretty good question.
It is a good question.
I don't know how often that happens, that you're afraid that you're going down into a cult, but
there are, I'm sure there are many wives, most wives probably at some point feel like their husbands aren't in the spiritual place where they should be. So, I mean, that happens, but you're talking about a cult specifically.
Right. We're not talking about like... he wants to leave the Baptist church and go to a non-denominational church, and you're like, no, we have to go to a Baptist church. Or if you're a traditional church and you're going to a charismatic church, and there might be concerns there. There always are concerns when you're switching churches and things like that. Or staying
in the same church.
Or staying, right. I need to get out of here.
There are concerns, for sure.
But when you are really concerned about a cult, what are you to do? And obviously, so... if you're listening to this show, maybe you understand where we come from somewhat, but we believe that the man is the head of the home, so he has to make the decisions. Now, it doesn't mean that he doesn't consult his wife on these decisions. You would be a fool not to consult your wife on some big decisions. And the one that I could think of that we did many, many years ago, and that was when we decided to leave traditional church, go into a building, brick and mortar building, and, we were in Bible college, and I was going to be a pastor and all this stuff. And we got married, and so that was your expectation. And I'm finding about the house church and the house church movement, and I'm like, I think we really need to go down this route. And you were not fully on board.
I was quite hesitant. I mean, I grew up in church and was at church every time the doors were open, and church was just a huge part of my life. So when, you're throwing this out there that maybe we'll just not go to church anymore, but go to church in people's homes, and it was just very different. So it was very scary.
Sure. And I wasn't going to move on it until I had you convinced. It's like, I'm convinced, and I've been sitting on this for about a year, but we wanted to make sure Abigail was born, and that tells you how long ago this was. And so I wasn't going to move on this until I had you on my side. And so and I can be pretty persuasive. And if I'm not persuasive, I'll keep talking to you forever until you give in.
So I want to be persuaded.
Right. But honestly, I didn't want to do something that you felt uncomfortable with. And to this day, I don't want to do something that you feel uncomfortable.
Which, for the guys listening, that's, I think, a great thing to do, is to try to convince your wife and give her time. And,
Yes.
like, okay, let me just be patient and let me see what I can do, come from a different angle or whatever, and try to get your wife to be on the same page.
Right. And it doesn't always have to, though, because that she would be leading the relationship at that point. Like, I don't feel comfortable about having chicken tonight. I'm like, well, we're going to have pizza. Anyway, but I on these big decisions, I really want you to understand where I'm coming from, and let's go together on this. Well, that's not what's happening in this scenario. And so how do you go? So I wanted to, how would you react from your perspective, and how I would react from my perspective as a husband and a wife. And so why don't we go ahead and go with your perspective? So the lady fears that her husband is joining a cult and wants her to go. What would you do?
Well, first of all, I believe strongly in the power of prayer.
Yes.
And I would go to my knees and I would cry out to God and say, I don't know what to do in this situation. I think that you're going down a road that I think is very dangerous and wrong. And so I would, first of all, pray.
Sure.
And then I would consider if there's a way that I could just follow you and just say, okay, this is what
Can I tolerate this enough?
Right. Can I at least go maybe check it out? Maybe, and I would trust that hopefully as we maybe would go into it, that God would redirect, and God would maybe, they would maybe say something at the meeting we go to, and
kind of wake you up a little bit.
Yeah, you'd be like, okay, I don't agree with that. And so I'd maybe look for opportunities for things that are said that I could maybe question you and be like, well, but do you agree with that? Like, that doesn't make sense to me. So I would try to, if at all possible, kind of go along with it. Right.
It's not sin necessarily, but we are talking about a cult here.
Right.
And you got to be very, very careful if you really think it is a cult. I don't know, you got to be really, really careful when you go down there. Like, just to get what you want, you could say it's a cult.
Right.
And you just have to be careful. You have to know your heart in this. Like, what is your real heart in this? And you're really concerned about your husband. That's fair.
Yeah.
But we don't know how long this has been going down. Has she been going? And she's just like, I can't. This is like, whoa. Like, what if I would decided we're going to a Catholic church, and you're like, well, okay, It's still about Jesus somewhat, like, I'm not taking communion. I'm not going to do this. Is there some compromise I can do that I will do this, but I won't do that? Is that fine? And so from a husband's perspective, I think we already showed you what I would do, and that is to sit up. And, no, but it is to consider where my wife is, and if she's very uncomfortable, she must be uncomfortable for a reason. Now, does she have a history of trying to control the relationship and manipulate and just get her way? Well, if that's not her, then maybe I need to really pay attention here. Why is this really bugging her? And I know she's been trying to get friends of his to like watch these videos and get them to watch. I would have no problem. Like if I'm really trying to hear your heart, if you said, I've been watching these videos and this is why I'm concerned, I would watch them. Mm-hmm. Now if I'm proud and arrogant, I'd be like, I'm not watching this stuff. You're not listening to me because you're rebellious and all this stuff. Well, I've got a heart issue at that point, and you got a marriage issue at that point, and you guys need some kind of counseling. You need to find someone to walk you through this. Someone at church, of course, then you're like, which church? The old one or the new one? And so that is a problem. But yeah, I would honestly, if I'm a woman, I would see that how much can I live with? Just for a while, is it the worst thing ever to go and, try this out and see what it is? If it really is that bad, you do have to protect yourself at some point. But like, I don't want to be influenced by cult-like things. This is dangerous. Now, the cult in question, I don't think it's immediately dangerous. It's not like a David Koresh type situation here. But it can mess with you in the future. So I would still be concerned. But as a husband, you need to listen to your wife, and when you're fully persuaded, and if you are fully persuaded, you gotta go and say, if she doesn't follow you, that's on her. You can't make her follow you. I think that is the problem a lot of guys have. Like, well, she won't follow me. Well, that's your problem. She has to obey God, and you can't just quote verses like "submit to me." You got to submit. Well, submission is a willing thing that even in war, when a captured person, like he has to get on his knees and submit. And even if they have to like make him, but he still has to do it. Like you can break his leg to where he's on his knees, or whatever. But when someone finally submits and they're like, I'm done. I'm not going to fight against you. And not saying that this is a situation between the wife and the husband.
We can hope not.
Right. But you have to willingly submit. And in this case, you have to, how much am I have to still lead my household, but her submission is between her and God. My loving her is between me and God. And she doesn't have the right to tell me, well, you have to love me. Well, you have to submit to me. If you've gotten to that point, you probably have many other issues at that point. So anyway, guys, listen to your wives, consider what she has to say, go through, you have to try to persuade her, especially in something that may be really different to her. And she's kind of scared. I mean, she's scared.
Well, and I think also wives can definitely appeal, and I can go to you and say, look, I'm really concerned about this, and here's my reasons why, and in a kind and gentle and humble way say these are my concerns. But also, I think we also need to remember as wives that our relationship with God is not made up of what happens on Sunday for 2 hours.
That's true.
So it's like you can sometimes go along with things that maybe you disagree with or whatever, but it's like it doesn't mean that your relationship with God is all in jeopardy because you showed up at some building that you don't agree with,
All right. But it is a big issue. I mean, it is not easy, and I'm sure this lady has had, some tearful nights, and so anyway, but I know we could go into it a lot more, because this is just a microcosm of most marriage is communication, at the heart of it. And if he just bulls his way through it and is like a bull in a china shop and just wants to get his way, well, it's not going to work out so well. And if she's just trying to manipulate the situation, then it's not going to work out either. But if they truly are seeking God and he's just caught up in something, I think eventually it'll come right. Yeah. But if she humbles herself for a while, maybe she'll have avenues to point out some of the errors.
Hey, this is Joshua Charleston, the producer of The Mike Charleston Show. Thank you for listening to the show. If you want to follow us, we're on Facebook at Mike Charleston Show and Instagram at _Mike Charleston Show. Please support us on Patreon for exclusive content. This episode is over, but if you want more, check out the website at fellowshipofbelievers.org for more information. The Mike Charleston Show has been brought to you by Fellowship of Believers.